Good morning, students. We're going to start each day with a passage from one of the books that we're studying in chapter 6 of your textbook, the first and second books of Samuel and the first book of Kings. And Hannah, the mother of Samuel, waited many years and prayed to God fervently for a child and promised God that her firstborn son would be dedicated to his service. And so Hannah becomes pregnant and gives birth to a son, Samuel, and he is adopted by Eli. So that means that although he's not of the tribe of Levi or by birth, he is by adoption. And so Hannah prays to God. My heart exalts in the Lord. My horn is exalted by my God. I have swallowed up my enemies. I rejoice in your victory. There is no Holy One like the Lord. There is no rock like our God. Speak boastfully no longer. Do not let arrogance issue from your mouths. For an all-knowing God is the Lord, a God who weighs actions. The bows of the mighty are broken, while the tottering gird on strength. The well-fed hire themselves out for bread, while the hungry no longer have to toil. The barren wife bears 7 sons, while the mother of many languishes. The Lord puts to death and gives life, casts down to Sheol, and brings up again. The Lord makes poor and makes rich, humbles and also exalts. He raises the needy from the dust, from the ash heap lifts up the poor, to seat with them with nobles, and make a glorious throne their heritage. For the pillars of the earth are the Lord's, and he has set the world upon them. He guards the footsteps of his faithful ones, but the wicked shall perish in the darkness. For not by strength does one prevail. The Lord's foes shall be shattered. The Most High in heaven thunders. The Lord judges the ends of the earth. May he give strength to his king and exalt the horn of his anointed. And then when the father of Samuel, Elkanah, returns home to Ramah with his wife, the child remained in the service of the Lord under the priest of Eli. Since only priests, the priest could only be from the house of Levi, when Eli adopts Samuel, he is able to become a priest, as well as a prophet, a Nazirite, and the last of the judges. So he is quite an amazing figure of transition from the time of the judges to the time of the kings. Now, we've been studying the family of Abraham. So Abraham's grandson, through Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob, has 12 sons and 1 daughter. One of those sons is Levi. So Samuel is going to become now part of the house of Levi. He also has a son, Judah, and Judah is the ancestor of King David and King Solomon. We're going to continue our look at the ups and downs of Israel's history. People from the time of Adam and Eve fall time and again, but they are lifted up by God, who makes covenants with Abraham that he will have a line, we will have descendants more numerous than the stars, and they will have a land of their own, the Holy Land we now call Israel. They also will have a mission. They are to proclaim the one true God as the creator, the redeemer, the sanctifier of all people. So it's not only going to be with the chosen people, it's going to be with all of us through Jesus Christ. But they are going to have problems because they remain in Egypt instead of returning to the Holy Land. They fall into slavery because they refuse to follow God's command to enter the promised land at the covenant of Sinai. They end up wandering in the desert for 40 years. Under Joshua, they do take over the promised land, but the fighting continues beyond Joshua's time because the Canaanite peoples fight against the chosen people. And also they have hostile enemies, the Philistines, who came across the Mediterranean to conquer their own amount of land. And that continues under the judges. Under King Saul and King David, they will be unified, but they will be battling the Philistines until finally David conquers them. And there is a time of peace under Solomon, who builds the temple in Jerusalem. So this is what we're going to be studying in chapter 6. So your different assignments are here. Tonight's assignment is to read pages 118 to 127 in your textbook, and you are to fill out 1 through 14 on the study guide, which is found on the upper right-hand corner of chapter 6. Okay, so it's right there, and make a copy. It will look like this. So today we're going to answer questions 1 through 14, okay, using the Google Side presentation right over here. So we have had the different tribes of Israel, and Joseph has 2 tribes for his 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. So these are the northern tribes: Dan, Ephraim, Manasseh, Gad, Reuben, Naphtali, Asher, Zebulun, Issachar. Now, the tribe of Levi has cities throughout the promised land. Judah and Simeon. Simeon is absorbed into Judah, and Benjamin joins Judah. So these are the southern tribes, and they are named for the largest tribe, which is Judah. So all this land on the east and west of the Jordan River, the Sea of Galilee, this is the Jordan River all the way from here, from really originating in Syria, and goes all the way down and empties out into the Dead Sea. So this is the landmass we're studying now. And in chapter 7, so this is it, the United Monarchy. And then it's going to split, and we'll study that in chapter 7. Why did Israel need to become a nation? Israel did not have a central leader. This threatened their security against enemies. Also, Israel did not meet the ideal of a people united in keeping God's covenant. The first 3 kings were Saul, David, and Solomon, in that order. The Deuteronomists had mixed feelings about Israel becoming a nation with a king, because they were writing beginning in the time of King Josiah and right through the exile, okay, the Babylonian exile. They saw kingship and nationhood from the perspective of 400 years later. Some aspects of being like other nations led to the nation's downfall. Now, at the very beginning, you're going to see that the elders of the 12 tribes come to Samuel, the last of the judges, and they tell him, we want to be like the other nations. We want to have a king. And this was because Samuel's sons were not virtuous, were not disinterested, loyal leaders like Samuel. They were corrupt. And so the people wanted nothing to do with the sons of Samuel. Instead, they thought a king would be better. But the Deuteronomists know that's not the case, that kings can believe themselves to be above the law of God and can be corrupt and unjust and idolatrous. Samuel warns the elders that a king will take their sons and daughters. He will also take their lands, flocks, and a tithe of their grains. A king will make the Israelites into slaves. Nevertheless, God tells Samuel, do what they tell you, anoint a king. And so Saul is anointed as the first king. God does reject Saul because Saul shows himself to be unfaithful, swayed by his own anxieties, and subject to the pressures of those around him. He does not trust God to follow God's commands. The story of David repeats the theme of God choosing the weakest and the lowliest. And so Samuel overlooks Jesse's older sons and secretly anoints the youngest, David, as king. We're going to look at that story of the anointing of David uh, because David is not invited to the feast with Samuel the prophet. All his older brothers are there dressed in their best, and he is tending the sheep. He is so insignificant, the family does not even think that David needs to be at the feast. But Samuel sends for him, and he is the one that God indicates through his spirit working through Samuel. This is the one I want. Now, there are two different accounts of how Saul meets David. One is a story of David slaying Goliath, and the other how David becomes the court musician for Saul and plays the harp for Saul. David also becomes a very able warrior, and as he conquers the enemies of Israel, Saul becomes jealous of David's attractiveness, military skill, and popularity. There's even a song that the women sing. Saul has killed thousands, and David has killed tens of thousands. And David comes to have a deep friendship with Saul's oldest son, Jonathan. He actually also marries the younger daughter of Saul, Michal. But instead of seeing this as really um, adopting David into the family and being proud of David, being proud that he has such a loyal son-in-law, Saul becomes jealous. Jonathan is not jealous. He's very confident of himself and his own abilities. And he has a great love and abiding respect for David, to the consternation of his family, or rather King Saul, because we don't hear of jealousy on the part of the other sons of Saul either. Although Saul is pursuing David, who becomes a refugee. Okay, he has to run for his life literally after he is married to Michal. But when he has the opportunity several times, David doesn't kill Saul, even when he has the opportunity. David also swears never to harm Saul's descendants, and he keeps his pledge. Saul's life ends at the end of the first book of Samuel. Battling the Philistines, Saul kills himself rather than let himself be taken. There is another version of the story. A soldier kills Saul when he fails to kill himself. Now, both of these stories are really against the belief of Judaism in the sacredness of life. Suicide is not seen as a virtuous, holy option, just as the Catholic Church condemns euthanasia and condemns assisted suicide. We also would condemn these two actions. The theme of the first book of Samuel is Saul's reign, and the theme of the second book of Samuel is the reign of David.